Good afternoon and welcome everyone. I am Rosa Cabrera, Director of the Rafael Cintrón Ortiz Latino Cultural Center, also known as the LCC. Thank you for joining us in this Zona Abierta online program, and also many thanks to the Office of Diversity and Inclusion and the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs for co-sponsoring this program today. Zona Abierta is one of our program series which highlights the intersection of the arts, humanities, science, and culture alongside civic life, with presentations by local, national, and international artists, scholars, and community leaders about pressing social and environmental issues affecting the life of Latinx and Latin Americans while making connections to other communities, especially here in the Chicagoland. Today's program is part of a sequence of 4 presentations that the LCC is hosting this semester called Radical Research from BIPOC Scholars at UIC. It will feature scholars who joined the Bridge to Faculty program at UIC. They will be sharing their experiences and respective research through an intersectional lens, revealing the complexity and particularity of their research and how the life of those in the margins are impacted. If you're not familiar with the Bridge to Faculty program, this is a recruitment initiative in the Office of Diversity designed to attract underrepresented postdoctoral candidates with the goal of a direct transition to a tenure-track junior faculty position after 2 years of completing the program. Today's presentation will be about 35 to 40 minutes long, followed by a short conversation with our guest speaker and facilitated by LCC's Associate Director, Jorge Menas Robles. So we invite you to put comments and questions on the chat, and Jorge will try to get through all of those, if possible. So now I am delighted to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Marisol Becerra, from Public Administration and Policy in the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs, better known as CUPPA. Dr. Becerra obtained her PhD in Environmental Social Science at The Ohio State University, her MS in Environmental Policy and Planning from the University of Michigan, and a BA in Public Policy Studies from DePaul University. She will share with us today her research on civic engagement, specifically the involvement of Latinx youth in Little Village, who were able to advocate and design public outdoor natural environments alongside community adults in a nonprofit organization there. Her research helps to better understand the complexities of increasing park access in Latinx neighborhoods and how poverty, race, both intersect with the development and implementation of environmental policy to address environmental pollution, such as brownfields situated in this particular neighborhood. This work is reflected in her empirical research published in Local Environment entitled Examining the Complexities of Increasing Park Access in Two Latinx Neighborhoods, and in her book chapter in From the Margins, Engaging Latinx Youth in Chicago's Little Village, published by Routledge. So now I would like to welcome Marisol. Bienvenida.
Gracias, Rosa. Hello, everyone. My name is Marisol, and I am thrilled to be able to share my research as well as some of my history and involvement with environmental justice in Chicago. So before we begin, I think it is important for me to define what environmental justice is, especially if there are some people who are new to the topic. So environmental justice overall is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income in the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental policies. There exists an executive order from 1994, which was signed by then President Clinton. And this executive order, the mission of it is to put environmental justice at the forefront and to include people from marginalized communities into the conversations and decision-making around environmental issues. This is very important because historically, the modern environmental movement has excluded working poor as well as communities of color from environmental decisions, from environmental engagement. And so as a result, environmental justice as a movement and as a field of study emerged. It is also important for me to share my identity and my position within this research. My research is heavily motivated by my experience living in Chicago's Little Village neighborhood, where I worked as a community organizer with an environmental justice organization, the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization, within 2003 to 2012. During this time period, there were several environmental justice campaigns within the Little Village neighborhood, most notably a campaign for clean air. So Little Village is home or was home to two of the largest coal-fired power plants in the nation, and also home to a lot of industry. So it was during my teen years that I began engaging in environmental justice work as a result of also fulfilling a requirement as a Chicago high school student. In order to graduate, you need to fulfill approximately 40 hours of community service. At least that was the requirement when I was in high school. And so I chose to do my community service hours at the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization. So that was kind of my entry point into environmental justice, civic engagement, and giving back to the community. So Little Village is very important, especially for the Mexican community in the nation, not just in Chicago. Little Village is the second largest Mexican American community in the US after East Los Angeles, and this is in terms of density. As a result, Little Village has a strong social network, and it is very culturally rich. It is also a historic immigrant destination, meaning that several people that migrate to the US choose to migrate to Little Village specifically because of those strong social networks and rich culture. And this is very much part of the reason why my family, my parents decided to migrate to Little Village, because of those social networks and culture. On the flip side though, Little Village is also situated next to industry. There are several abandoned lots, various types of industry, a lot of them from the post-industrial era. So as a result, Little Village is dealing with the challenges of what it's like to live in a post-industrial neighborhood. From about 2000 to the present, Little Village has undergone significant changes. As mentioned earlier, there was a campaign for clean air. There was a lot of pressure to shut down Chicago's coal power plant, which was achieved in 2012. And this was after a 10-year campaign to pressure the coal power plants to shut down. So that was achieved in 2012. Between 2003 to about 2014, we have this second site that I will focus most of this presentation on. And this is the Celotech site. It's located on the east side of the neighborhood. And the Celotech site, like many other sites, was industrial. The site was known to store, make, and sell asphalt roofing products. And this industry stopped operations around the 1980s, but as a result, there was this big vacant lot, 15 acres, abandoned and just sitting idle. As you can see here, often this land was used to park trailer trucks. And so community residents were very upset about this land use. They were concerned, and they had concerns about environmental issues such as exposure to environmental hazards. As a result of community residents filing complaints to EPA and to investigate if the land is contaminated, EPA found that there were traces of carcinogenic contaminants. And so this led the EPA, as well as many other entities, to collaborate into the cleanup of the site. So simultaneously with the conversations about cleaning up the site, there were also conversations about advocating for park space. So at this time, this is early 2010s or so, at the time there was only one park in Little Village, and that was on the west side of the neighborhood. And so several community residents, organizations, and even one of the local Catholic churches came together to organize within the neighborhood and to demand from local elected officials that there was a need for another park in the neighborhood. Now, Little Village is a very young neighborhood. Over half are under the age of 30. And in the context of early 2010s, we're talking about a young population under the age of 21. So there's a big demand for space, especially green space, for young people to go and hang out and stay away from any other negative activities. And so as a result, there were several challenges from demanding access to green space. And I'll mention a few of them. So one of the major challenges in creating the brownfield, so the former industrial site Celotex, into a park was administrative boundaries, such as gerrymandering and gang boundaries. So one of the main reasons why a park was needed in the neighborhood is because a lot of the young people that grew up on the west side of the neighborhood couldn't access the park on the east side. And that was very much just simply because of where they were geographically located. Even if kids were not affiliated with gangs, just the fact that they were crossing a gang boundary was a significant matter of concern. And so that was one of the main points advocated or used to advocate for park access in Little Village. And then the administrative boundary issue, it can be very difficult for environmental issues in Little Village to get addressed because the neighborhood is gerrymandered. And so as we can see, the majority of the area of Little Village, which is shaded in gray in this map that you can see, about half of it falls in the 22nd Ward, and then the rest of it is gerrymandered. So the east side has a bit less political power, or at least uniform political power, to advocate for needs. So it really took a lot of effort for community residents on the east side of the neighborhood to organize for the cleanup of the site, as well as its eventual redevelopment, which I will talk more about in the next few slides. So local organizations and the Catholic Church in the neighborhood were demanding more park access. And so in the literature, park access is defined in various ways. So most of the research focuses on park access as it relates to geographic access. So physical distance to a park, for example. However, there are some scholars that argue that that there is only perceived access to parks. So it's important to examine not just geographic access and proximity, but also what are some things that could inhibit that access. And so eventually we have the redevelopment of the Celotex site into a park in 2014. And so here I want to highlight the year 2014 because this effort began in the early 2000s. So it also took approximately a decade for the site to be cleaned up and for redevelopment to happen, for a park to be open and accessible. So as all of this is unfolding, I was also traveling around New York City to neighborhoods that were going through similar issues as Little Village. So neighborhoods that have brownfield sites and were experiencing the process of redevelopment. And I asked myself, what happens after low income and communities of color achieve environmental victories? Because most of the people in Little Village that lived around that site or continue to live around that site bear the environmental burdens of living next to environmental hazards. So in other words, is this environmental justice for everyone? Is it environmental justice for some? So these are questions that I kept thinking about. And this is an article from the New York Times from one of the neighborhoods that I had visited in the early 2010s. So this is Sunset Park, a historically immigrant neighborhood in Brooklyn with a large percentage of Latinos and Asian residents in the neighborhood. And I'll read a brief quote from that article. In Sunset Park, a call for innovation leads to fears of gentrification. We made this community more green. It took us 15 years for us to get this. People who work in this neighborhood live in this neighborhood. And now we're going to lose it to gentrification. These are some of the similar questions that I also had. And so engaging in conversation with community activists from this neighborhood, including Elizabeth Jean-Pierre, really made me question this further and motivated me to focus my research on green redevelopment and gentrification to fully examine who gets to benefit from an improved environment. And so for those who may not be as familiar with the definition of gentrification, I have one here on green gentrification in specific, because this is a type of gentrification that's centered around improving environmental conditions. So Gould and Lewis define green gentrification as a public policy process in which environmental improvements tend to increase racial and class inequality and decrease environmental justice. So in addition, there's three main aspects of green gentrification. So it's the distributional and procedural impact of environmental improvement projects, class and race, and market-led perspectives. So this is a picture from the 606 Trail in Humboldt Park, also known as the Bloomingdale Trail. I took this picture on the day of its opening. I believe it was around 2016, 2017. And it says, luxury single family, experience the 606 Trail from a place called home. When I saw this image, I honestly was very shocked because I was taking into consideration the history of Humboldt Park as a working class, predominantly Puerto Rican neighborhood. And I asked myself, who can afford a luxury single family, taking into consideration the historical demographics of this neighborhood? And so it kind of fell in line with some of those questions that I was having. Like, does this green redevelopment benefit the existing residents? Will there be a threat of displacement, etc.? So while I was conducting my dissertation research, interviewing residents around the La Villita Park, I also met with Mariela Fernandez and Brandon Harris, who were also working on research in Latino communities in Chicago, specifically with regard to park access. And so one of the beautiful things about meeting other academics, other people that are doing research that's similar to yours, is the ability to share the information that you've gathered and build collaborations. So from summer 2015 and 2016, we were all in Chicago doing the similar research and decided, hey, it would be a good idea to do a comparative study and see if we are observing similar trends and share that with the academic community as well as our respective communities. So that resulted in this comparative study, which I will briefly highlight. I won't have time to go through all of the findings, but I want to highlight two. So within this study, we were looking at what are the benefits and the unintended consequences of increasing park space in Latino neighborhoods. So I'll focus on health, social interaction, And on the unintended consequences side, I'll focus on property taxes and gentrification. So the research method for this study was mainly ethnography, conducting resident semi-structured interviews between 2015 and 2016 in Little Village and Humboldt Park. So here we have a map of Chicago with neighborhoods that I highlighted in orange to show the historical displacement of Latinos in Chicago, as well as the study sites, Humboldt Park and South Lawndale, also known as Little Village. And so there has been this displacement pattern in Chicago, specifically with the Latino community, where the displacement historically has been moving westward. So like in the 70s and 80s, there was movement into from Lincoln Park to Humboldt Park for the Puerto Rican community. And for the Mexican community, you saw movement happening from what is now UIC, Pilsen, all of those communities shifting into Little Village. And today, some of those communities within Humboldt Park and Little Village are also shifting out into the nearby suburbs. So a historical pattern of movement westward, away from the loop. So I'll talk about some of the benefits that we saw within our study. When discussing La Villita Park, residents linked it to positive health outcomes and behaviors. Specifically, physical activity was mentioned by a few participants. One of our participants is Roy. Roy stated, "I can walk the dog in the park now that they built it. It's pretty beneficial. The park gives everybody somewhere else to go, like the kids from the neighborhood. Instead of just being out on the streets, they have a nice big park. It helps them be active and not stay at home just playing video games." Other benefits discussed also focused on physical activity. So for example, Roy mentioned, "I walk the dog at the park," and also stated the benefits to kids, going outside instead of being at home playing video games. Leo also mentioned, "I like paths to walk. I like to walk in the summer, and they have a skate park too." So again, residents highlighting physical activity. With regard to the Bloomingdale Trail, these are some of the quotes that emerged from these interviews. "The Bloomingdale Trail gives me another option besides running in the park," in reference to Humboldt Park. "I think everyone likes it. Every day it is full with people exercising or relaxing. It's really nice." Another participant, Alex, stated, "I love it, man. I'm on here every day. It lets me and him, the dog, get some exercise. I used to take him to the park, but this is just better." There were also references to improved mental health, which we found really interesting, especially with regard to Little Village. And I'll share a few of those quotes here. Oscar, one of our participants, mentioned, "Speaking of the new space, me sirve de terapia. It serves me like therapy." Roy explained that before the park was created, the empty lot wasn't a pleasant thing to look at every day, especially when you came out. Instead of feeling motivated to do better, you kind of just got depressed. It doesn't really help our attitude at the beginning of the day. So Roy, in sharing the story, highlights that his attitude changed when the park was created in front of his home. For the Bloomingdale Trail, we also noticed similar trends, similar patterns from our interviewees. So for example, Julian, when talking about the trail, he mentioned that it gives him a place where he can play and feel safe and not have to worry about anything. Ali mentioned, "It is so pretty down here. Look at all this green. There are not many places in Chicago with this much green." Thomas, a Puerto Rican teen living in Humboldt Park, said that the Greenway was a place for him to remove himself from the stresses of his home environment, calling the trail an escape. So as you can see, several residents highlight mental health as a positive health outcome. Similarly, with social interaction, residents shared that the park helped create better and stronger social interaction. For example, in Little Village, Cesar mentioned, I've gotten more connected to my friends because it was either I got the chance to skate with them once a day, but now we meet up all the time, so we have more connection to each other. He also added that the park was really important because then families have a better way to enjoy time with their kids. Without a park, they just go to their house and stay inside. Having a park, it's way easier for them to take care and to take the kids out to play. For Humboldt Park, Mia, one of our interviewees, explained, it's been amazing for the neighborhood. It's gotten folks outside. They look like they haven't, especially those who have looked like they haven't been outside in years or ever. It's a social movement. It's a gathering place. There's exercise, bike riding, and training. So those are some of the main highlights from the health benefits, both physical and mental, as well as stronger social interaction. Now, some of the unintended consequences observed from this comparative study are rising taxes and gentrification. We found Roy's story of displacement very compelling and very interesting, especially for outlining this historic pattern of displacement westward over the decades in Chicago. So Roy shared his displacement story. He shared that he is a father of two and resident of Little Village, and he told us why he moved to Little Village. My family moved out from over there, from Pilsen. We had an apartment. We were paying $600. Then they started doing little things to Pilsen, the neighborhood next to Little Village. It bumped the rent to $1,800. When we bought this house, we got a pretty good deal in building up the house. But as soon as taxes started coming in, everything started going up. Now they're also talking about a hospital being built around the corner. So they're already talking about raising taxes because of that. So it does get a little hectic around the end of the year when you've got to pay property taxes. It's a lot more than we were paying in mortgage a month. So here again, Roy is highlighting this pattern of displacement and how it has impacted him, how it impacted him originally in Pilsen. And he's starting to see that this could potentially happen in Little Village. Most importantly, he's also looking at the park as a potential catalyst for future redevelopment. There were similar reports from other residents, especially in Humboldt Park, and we saw the most references to concerns about gentrification in Humboldt Park. And I'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end. So in Humboldt Park, for many residents, the threat of gentrification represented an attack on space, especially spaces that the community depended on. So we noticed this with the use of possessive pronouns, which were frequently used in speaking about the neighborhood, indicating attachment to the space. For example, when asked about development in the neighborhood, Michelle responded, "People are worried and angry. This neighborhood is important to us. This is our place in Chicago. All you have to do is walk through the neighborhood and you know who it belongs to." Similarly, Robert shared, "The trail is being used as a way to change Humboldt Park. This has been the story for all minorities in Chicago. We're pushed into communities and segregated until it is convenient, and then boom, we're gentrified. Once a neighborhood becomes or is seen as beneficial for developers, it is no longer beneficial for it to be occupied by us." Serena similarly echoed concerns. "I'm worried. Have you seen the houses going up? Those aren't meant for us. These people want to move into our neighborhood and change it. They don't want to talk to you or your family. They just want to take over. They're using this, the trail, as a way to get new people in here to change this place. This has been our Puerto Rican community for a long time, but you know how Chicago is. If they think it can make money, they don't care." So we looked a little further into this because we noticed that was a very common theme in the interviews with Humboldt Park and to a little extent in Little Village. So we took a look at some Zillow data and saw that in June 2015, the first summer since the park opened in Little Village, there was a record high of 68 homes foreclosed, compared to 6 foreclosures reported in March 2018. Rent prices increased by 8%, from 1,314 in January 2015 to 1,430 in December 2018. In Humboldt Park, residents experienced as much as 22.3% increase in property value, 22.3% increase. So this translated into approximately 100K in premium. When taking into consideration that the median household income in Humboldt Park is 35, which is 32% lower than the median income of 52K for the city of Chicago, we see that there's small increases to residents' cost of living, and this has a dramatic economic impact on them. So some of the observations from Little Village, for us, it was really interesting to find that the study had a big difference between the major concerns expressed in Little Village and Humboldt Park, particularly to how residents talked about property tax and gentrification. So in both situations, in both places, we found conversations around property tax as a worry, but we didn't see such a concern with gentrification at that time. So this is between 2015, 2016 in Little Village. So with Little Village, it seemed like most of the focus on the unintended consequences was resulting from the increase in property taxes associated with La Villita Park. So we interpreted this in the following way. So the absence of residents' awareness over the possibility of gentrification is interesting and commands further discussion. This unawareness may stem from Little Village remaining a segregated enclave that either may hold little potential for developers to profit from gentrification efforts, or may have isolated residents from discussions of gentrification. Now, I think it's very, very important to note that this study that I've shared with you was published in late 2019, December 2019. And the data used for this paper was collected between 2015 and 2016. So just to show like the data collection to publication timeline's pretty long there. But also there's a lot that has happened in Little Village since our data collection period and since our publication date. And I'll highlight some of that in the following slides. So around 2020, there were conversations happening in Little Village and newspaper articles that I'll share in a little bit about more redevelopment happening within close proximity of the park. And so these are some images that I retrieved from a planning memo by the Mid-America Real Estate Corporation, which brands the Discount Mall area, which is to the north of La Villita Park, as you can see in the map on the left. It brands the Discount Mall as Little Village Plaza. Big things are happening in Little Village. And this is like a redevelopment plan that was shared with the potential future owners of this site. It's important to note that this particular site that's north to La Villita Park is a very important site to a lot of residents in Little Village. It is the home of Discount Mall, which is a mall with several small to medium-sized stands with local entrepreneurs who have their stands to sell goods. There's also a lot of stands where people can buy quinceañera dresses or can buy musical instruments. So it's a site that isn't only beneficial to the residents of Little Village, but in fact, it also attracts people from outside of the state. There are many Mexican communities throughout the Midwest and families throughout the Midwest that are Mexican or Mexican American and drive like 6 hours from Ohio to Little Village just to purchase items for significant events like quinceañeras, baptisms, etc. So this is a site with a lot of cultural significance for the community. And there have been various news articles highlighting this. For example, this is an article from the Chicago Tribune from 2020. Discount mall vendors ally with young activists to fight displacement in Little Village. This is not just a mall, this is our culture. So I highlight this because a lot of the conversations that we had with residents, particularly with regard to Little Village, didn't at first expect or think about gentrification becoming a threat during the years that we were collecting data. However, as of 2020, gentrification has very much been at the forefront of a lot of organizing conversations among young people organizing in Little Village. So there's been an increasing focus on anti-displacement campaigns to prevent gentrification, or to talk about what measures can be implemented to reduce those negative impacts. There has been a lot of literature also that that asks the question, how green is green enough? And I want to challenge that question, because it shouldn't be a question of how green or how many amenities should a community have, or how many amenities a community can have before it becomes gentrified. I think the question should be, how can we make sure that people have access to what they need equitably without the threat of gentrification? So in other words, why can't we have nice things? Because we know that a lot of these things are due to like institutionalized racism, history of segregation and redlining. All of those things impact our current day. So there has been continued organizing on this issue. There is so much more research to be done, because this is something that doesn't only impact Little Village. There are many, many brownfield sites, thousands across the United States, abandoned former industrial sites that are sitting idle. And so it could be beneficial for communities that have these brownfields to redevelop them, but to redevelop them while also thinking about the potential social impact upon those communities, which I think the brownfield process sometimes does not fully engage in conversation with. So there's so much more to learn about this topic. I wish I had all the answers to it, but if anything, there's always something that everyone can contribute, their strengths, their skills, whether that's organizing, whether that's teaching or research. There's always something that someone can contribute to the environmental justice movement. So I'll end with that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Marisol Becerra. Hi, everyone. This is Jorge Mena. And I just wanted to thank you for your presentation and for sharing your research with us today. We do have a couple questions for you that were submitted, but I also want to invite anyone who has a comment, a thought, a question to share to please write it in the chat, or feel free to raise your hand under the reaction button on Zoom so we can call on you. We have about 15 minutes. Dr. Becerra, you noted earlier that the Celotech site turned into a park in 2014 and that work took approximately a decade. How do you respond to folks who say, in order to address an issue of public concern, they should focus their energy on voting and getting others to vote? Second, what are your thoughts on how to talk about civic engagement with community members like family that feel jaded by not seeing much local change after voting for progressives?
Okay, so that's a two-part. So what do I think about the role of voting in these issues? And then the second,
how to talk about civic engagement with community members that maybe have been voting but feel like they don't see much change after voting.
Yeah, no, those are great questions. So voting isn't the end all be all. It's very important to vote if you have the privilege to vote. The reality is not everyone in Little Village can vote. Little Village is home to a large immigrant community that does not have the access to vote. And so it's very important for people that do have that privilege to use it and to use it wisely. Now, with regard to civic engagement and voting, I think it goes hand in hand. Civic engagement shouldn't be limited to just voting. Voting is a one action thing, very important, but it also needs to be followed up with concrete civic engagement. So engaging in community meetings, engaging, for example, with the local school council. There are many issues that are interconnected in Little Village and in many other communities across the United States that requires our active engagement. Sometimes that can be limited because oftentimes, especially in working class communities, people work more than one job, sometimes 2 or 3. And so it's understandable if people don't have that extra time to do so, but they can also organize within their workplaces and talk to their coworkers about this. So it's about sharing information with your community, with your coworkers, with those around you, voting if you have the privilege to vote, but also people are strong in numbers. And so it's understandable, like one person is not going to change this. It's going to take a group of people that are committed, that share the same vision. So civic engagement is very important in conjunction with voting.
Thank you, Marisol. A couple of comments. While I really like this section where you talked about how after environmental hazards are addressed, these communities are instantly faced with new challenges, namely gentrification. And thanks for this presentation, super enlightening, especially about green gentrification. I had not heard that term before. A question I think following what you just answered is, as we think about youth advocacy, and you said there's strength in numbers, one of the things that came to mind is some of the generational shifts. I think often when we think about environmental climate justice, we hear about young people fighting for action. And your work highlights the advocacy of youth in Little Village fighting displacement. Can you talk more about how you see or respond to generational differences and how elders and youth engage in this collective work? Yeah, how do you view the role of youth activism to build power?
Yeah. Youth play an important part in activism. If we look back to some of the major movements, like the Civil Rights Movement, Chicano movement, like a lot of those movements were led by young people, by students. So youth have an important role. And I experienced this myself as a teen and college student. When I was organizing, I would often hear leaders, elected officials, and even like at the federal and international level say, oh, we're so glad young people are so active because you're the future. And it really upset me because I'm talking to you and you're in a role of power and you're telling me you can't do anything, but you're hopeful for the future because it's going to be up to us to fix it. Like, no, that's not okay. So hold your elected officials, public officials accountable. Youth do not accept that as an answer. That was something I encountered a lot. Yeah, there's definitely more on this. Give me a few seconds. So yes, hold your elected officials accountable. Also, don't feel like you have to wait until you're done with high school or college to create change, because the reality is you're creating change right now in several different ways. Especially those of you who are enrolled at UIC and are watching this, like just the fact that you are in college, that you are pursuing your dreams and your aspirations, that's already a step forward. So the sky's the limit, and you don't have to wait until you are like 45 or 35 to run for Congress to create change. Change has various, there's various ways to contribute to change, is what I'm trying to say. There's one thing also that I want to highlight. and that's the impact of exposure to environmental hazards and health, specifically in the context of green gentrification. I think someone mentioned here that they were glad I highlighted how community residents had bared that environmental burden before redevelopment and now are facing this threat of displacement. And I think there's various important things to look at here and to take into consideration, because as displacement is happening, there's going to be, or there are people who are still in the neighborhood and want to stay in the neighborhood. There's people who, unfortunately, because of the rising costs of living in the city of Chicago and a Little Village, have moved. And so there's the concept of like exposure to environmental hazards and the impact on the life course. So the impact on individuals and populations across time, especially for young children and the elderly in Little Village. Exposure to environmental hazards can impact significantly. And I think there's a need for more research on what that impact is.
Awesome. Thank you, Marisol. And thank you for reminding us that the youth exist in the present. I really appreciated what you had said. I have a question here in the chat. Back to your earlier, to your question, Marisol, how can people have equitable access to what they need, including green spaces, without the fear of gentrification? Do you know of any examples where residents have been able to successfully stop or slow gentrification?
This is a big question. And it's challenging because we are in a time where there's a lot of these brownfield redevelopments happening throughout the nation, but also throughout the world. It's not just a US issue. There have been some tools or some, I'm going to call them policy tools. There's been some policy tools or suggestions that could help mitigate displacement, that could help ease the fear of gentrification. Some of them could be further institutionalized. So things like memorandums of understanding, where if there is a redevelopment happening in a community, having several meetings with community members that are not just where community members come and listen, but more so meetings where community members are active participants at every step of the planning process with local elected officials and planners. So being engaged at every step of the process and having that memorandum of understanding that no decision will be made without community input. That can be one solution. And there's been some exploration on this within the literature. Rent control is also something that has been widely discussed. I've had to see, and I'd have to look further and see like what has come about from that. But I know that that is a common recommendation made, rent control, to prevent higher prices from displacing long-term residents. But there's definitely a need to further explore this, especially within urban planning, to have those conversations of how can this look like so that we don't have to worry about displacing people, because ultimately this is a question about equity. Like how can we have an equitable environment for everyone, not just for some? And there's a lot here. And honestly, I think it stems to the fact that there's a lot of institutionalized racism still embedded. And it's going to take a great amount of effort to undo it. So it's not going to be just one policy. The policies that I think at this point are like a mitigation strategy, but really we need to think about how can we restructure this mess, because it's affecting everyone.
Thank you, Marisol. We have a couple of more questions. Because you were just speaking on gentrification. Someone wrote, what are your thoughts on hintification, a play on the word gente, which means people in Spanish, and gentrification and its role in displacement of POC by POC?
Yes, that's an excellent question. And there's been new and emerging research. If you're really interested in this topic, there's been an article recently published by think it's Alfredo Guante from UCLA. And he looks at this process of hintification in Boyle Heights. So there's several things happening here within this term. So with the process of hintification, how I understand it is the process of more affluent Latinos coming into an immigrant enclave to live there, but with the intention of wanting to live there to consume the culture. And so oftentimes these are people that did not grow up in immigrant enclaves and desire to reconnect with their roots, which is completely understandable, but it's not a level playing field for all, especially when it comes to accessing housing. So there are tensions there, and it's definitely a topic that merits further exploration.
Thank you for that response. I think it really speaks to how gentrification is multifaceted and complex, and it's not just about race. Mm-hmm. Let's see, I'm trying to pick and choose since we only have a couple of minutes left.
No problem.
You talked about how crossing gang boundaries as a concern was used to advocate for park access. As we think about the topics and links of policing and environmental, climate justice, and the devaluation of Black and Brown lives, what impact, if any, has the increased focus on racial tensions had on civic engagement in the neighborhoods that your research focuses on?
I mean, the racial reckoning that we've experienced in the past 2 years or so has been very significant across the nation, not just our neighborhood, not just Humboldt Park. And when I say our, I mean Little Village, because that's where I grew up. How has it impacted? I think, there was some racial tensions happening in the neighborhood, unfortunately, but it was also opportunities to highlight that there are strong alliances and coalitions between the Black and Latino community in Chicago. And that's very important because everyone is impacted by all of the systemic inequalities that we're experiencing in Chicago. And Chicago is one of the most segregated cities in the nation. So even more so, the urgent need to collaborate and support each other.
I know that is not an easy question to answer, and there's so much more to be said, but thank you for addressing
there's so
it.
much to be said also on policing, gentrification mm-hmm. and policing is, a big topic to explore as well. Definitely.
One of the last questions, maybe the last question. Can you talk about the recent articles noting that Zillow, a real estate site, and its side hustle to buy thousands of homes on the impact that has on residents or park access? I don't know if that's something in your peripheries.
I mean, so if I'm understanding correctly, this is Zillow's approach to buying and holding
thousands
land.
Of homes, correct.
Yeah, I mean, that has a significant impact because that process is more so like purchasing or acquiring land, holding it. And I suspect that would be to sell it when there's an appropriate time to make a profit, which to me sounds like holding it until there's more development and a higher demand and willingness to pay for higher rent. So yes, that has a very negative impact on the social fabric of Chicago neighborhoods.
Yeah, I think to your point, it also sort of speaks to the generational shifts. Some of the issues that previous generations dealt with are not the same issues. Some are, but not every issue is the same. I wanted to read one comment that was here and then see if you had any last words to say. Missy wrote, I really appreciate the emphasis on involving community members actively in the process of community development. So their voice is a huge part of the process. They said they have to run to an event, but they learned a lot and appreciate your presentation.
Thank you.
Any last words that you wanted to share with us, Dr. Marisol Becerra?
Yeah, so this is something I often share with my students. I taught environmental justice last semester, undergraduate level. And my students often share, like, sometimes I feel hopeless. because of environmental injustices, because of climate change, because of the pandemic. And I just want to remind you that everyone has something to contribute. We're not in this alone. And this is why it's so important to bring diverse voices into the academy, to research the questions that are of interest to communities like Little Village, like Humboldt Park, and to amplify the stories of the most marginalized.
Very well said. Thank you so much. And thank you again for your research and for sharing your wisdom with us. You've given us plenty to continue thinking about after this event. Everyone in the space, please join me in thanking our speaker by using the chat or the reaction button. And as we mentioned, this is the first presentation in our Radical Research series. I hope you can all join us for the next scholar presentation, which is scheduled for Wednesday, March 9th at 3 p.m., where Dr. Maria Eugenia Lopez Garcia from Museum and Exhibition Studies will talk about her research around social experiences of migrant and immigrant domestic workers. You can register for this event on our website, and the recording for this presentation will be also on our website in the incoming days. This brings our program to a close, but thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you again, Dr. Marisol Becerra, and we hope everyone has a lovely day.